And hello, everybody, and welcome, one and all. Welcome to Faith in the Future. My name is Lorenz Lebrija. I'm the director of TryTank, the Experimental Laboratory. And as we are all coming into the room right now, I see the numbers populating very quickly. It's amazing how quickly that thing starts to do. It's just all of you coming in. Everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome to Faith in the Future. Welcome as you all come on in. Because of the sheer number of people who have signed up for the workshop today, it's close to 320. I think it was like 318 last number I saw. No, 317 was the last number that I saw. That we're expecting a whole bunch of you to join us this afternoon. So we will be using the question and answer feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is a little Q&A button that you can see. It might be actually, now I realize because I'm sharing my screen, that it might be elsewhere, but right next to where it says polling and all the other information, your video, your mute, there's a Q&A button. If you click on that, whenever you have any questions, if you put them on there, then we can keep them organized. So just we'll be using the Q&A feature, and we encourage you to begin using that now. When you're joining us now, if you take a moment and just say hello you want to say it to all panelists and attendees as you go into the chat. Because otherwise only we would get to see who's here, but we want to know that you're all here. So what's your name, where you are at, and say hello so that we can get to see you all.
It's like a family reunion. Hi, Dave. Hi, Ellen. Hi, Keith. Hi, Rosie.
Look
Penny,
at all the people saying hello.
Anne, this is great.
Dean Bridges from the Cathedral in San Diego.
I'm glad to get some East Coasters. We were warming up, and for a rare moment there, I was the only East Coast person on this panel. So we're getting the weight back here. Oh my gosh, look at these.
We have a ton of people joining us here today. Excellent.
Wonderful.
Welcome, everybody, one and all. Just once again, as when you're coming in, if you can just tell us your name, where you're
Mary Hawes from the UK. You may win the Distance Award.
And a reminder, we will be using the Q&A feature. If you have questions throughout the program, just put them in there so that we can put them in there. The chat box tends to get a little complicated when we have so many people joining us at once. So we want to make sure that we're able to get to your questions. Also, some of the resources that will be featured or mentioned today, not the least of which is the book, one of the books that Bob has written, which is really good. It's called Full Spectrum Thinking, and they've been kind enough to offer us a discount. So you can get it for 40% off, including the shipping, which is free. So if you go to trytank.org, the resources will be there. Eventually, this recording of this webinar will be there as well. Again, everybody, welcome.
South Africa, I see
you. My name is the Reverend Lorenz Lebrija. I am the director of the TryTank, the Experimental Laboratory for Church Growth and Innovation, and it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you. So now that we are here and it's a few minutes past the hour, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to Dr. Lisa Kimball, who will do the introductions from here and take it away. So Lisa, take it away.
Welcome, everybody. I am delighted that you're here. I'm Lisa Kimball. I serve on the faculty at Virginia Seminary. I am the Associate Dean of Lifelong Learning, the home in which TryTank lives. So it is my privilege to be part of this conversation today. And it is thrilling to me that we have Bob Johansen with us. By title, he is a distinguished fellow, not just a fellow, a distinguished fellow at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, which is a world I used to romp because I went to Stanford. So that's a world I know well. But he is also a person who has devoted his professional life to listening deeply and to articulating forecasts for organizations, for corporations, for nonprofits that are significantly impacted by this work. He's worked with Procter & Gamble, with Kellogg's, with Disney. He's worked with Intuit, with Walmart. He's also worked with the Episcopal Church. And in 2007, in fact, the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, fondly known by many of us as CEEP, and also co-sponsoring this webinar, contracted with Bob and his colleagues and at the Institute for the Future, and they prepared a custom forecast for the Episcopal Church. What was presented then in a custom map of future forces that they anticipated would affect the Episcopal Church, a book of provocation, I love that title, digital stories, and an accompanying guide for using those resources in local congregations and in dioceses, has proved to be extraordinarily relevant. When I look at it today, it was written as an invitation to imagine and to act faithfully into an uncertain future. And here are 3 examples of driving forces they identified. And here we are in 2020 and how relevant they are. Personal empowerment from consumption and to customization. Polarizing extremes from fringe to front and center. And health insecurity. To quote the map, as the world grows more connected, challenges like pandemics will get close and personal. So a lot of work and a lot of miles have passed since then. And this spring, Bob published Full Spectrum Thinking. There it is. He published Full Spectrum Thinking, which is the 3rd book in his trilogy of leadership books offered to leaders across the globe at this point in his history. He has committed himself to this work and is generously offering his time with us today. I am particularly excited that we're accompanied with Gabe Cervantes also. Gabe served as Bob's research assistant on Full Spectrum Thinking and is in his own right, as I've discovered in our conversations, a passionate and articulate futurist. Gabe is now a research manager at the Institute for the Future, and he's focused on diaspora studies. For many of us, the diaspora has always meant physical movement of peoples, but he's looking at a much more distinct form of diaspora. He's exploring a digital diaspora and the implications that has for our future. So Gabe, I am really, really glad that you're here. My hope, particularly in engaging Bob and Gabe today, is that we as church leaders on Juneteenth in 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic of the coronavirus, with US deaths still rising, and witnessing every day to a renewed public cry for racial and economic justice after the most recent police killings, will pay closer attention than we did 10 years ago. We were then, in my opinion, as a denomination, too often self-satisfied and often myopic to welcome the provocation of a brilliant futurist. Today, however, I truly believe that we are humbled, that we are unsettled, that we are longing, and that many of us are beginning to glimpse God's promise to make all things new. May this conversation we are entering into with Bob Johansen and Gabe Cervantes kindle our hope, stir our imaginations, convict our courage, and deepen our faith in God, our neighbors, and the future. The plan is really simple. Bob and Gabe are going to present 3 provocative ideas, and after each one, I will attempt to facilitate a short conversation with them using as many of your questions from the Q&A section as possible. And after the final presentation, we'll have a longer period of time for open discussion and Q&A. So please do let us know what you're wondering and ask the questions you honestly have. And then following the webinar, you will receive a recording of this, and you'll be able to access the PDFs of that 2008 study that they did for the Episcopal Church, the forecast map and the Book of Provocation on the TryTank website. So my hope there is that it will help you stimulate your commitment to full spectrum thinking. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob and Gabe.
Thank you, Lisa. Wow, that's the nicest introduction I've gotten in a long time. It actually brings tears to my eyes, which isn't a normal reaction for me to introductions. But I do feel close to you and to this community and to this faith structure in a way that I want to share right at the beginning. I've always thought that the Episcopal faith has a kind of advantage in thinking about the future because of your concept of discerning questions, which I always found very attractive. It builds on your 3-legged stool as you talk about it, but it's this notion of discerning questions that don't have a yes or no answer. So it requires full spectrum thinking to be able to engage with that. And I learned that from our mentor within the Episcopal faith, Jim Diamond, who some of you may recall, who was the dean of the Christ Church Cathedral in Cincinnati, who I met in Cincinnati. But today it's great to have Gabe with me. Gabe and I are a cross-generational team, as you'll probably be able to notice as you look at the picture. Everything we do at the Institute is cross-generational. And I love the title for this, Faith in the Future. I've been really interested in writing a book called that for years now, for more than a decade, and haven't quite got my mind around how to do it yet. So maybe you'll help me understand that. I love the double meaning of the concept of faith in the future and also the concept of faith in the future. And I hope we can touch on both of those things. So Gabe, let me just get your voice in the air right away and say a little bit about, Gabe has also had an interest in things spiritual as he was growing up, although we come from very different backgrounds. So maybe you could share that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Lisa. It really is such a pleasure to be here with you. I am truly humbled to even have a voice in this webinar and with this audience here. So first off, thank you for that. As Bob mentioned, I grew up in Silicon Valley here in California. I grew up in a little city called East Palo Alto, and I grew up in the Apostolic Pentecostal faith, and a very small Latino community kind of centered around those beliefs and those ideals. Have since kind of pivoted and moved a little away from that, but still holds a dear place in my heart. Lisa, one thing that I forgot to mention to you, which I don't know how it could have happened, but Bob knows this. I have a great love for gospel music, and so much so that when I was an undergraduate student at Williams College, I was the gospel choir director for the Williams College Gospel Choir, and that's always held a very special place in my heart, and that music and that connection to the world that you all live in and that you operate in. So once again, thank you for having me.
It's really wonderful you're here. And if I remember correctly, are you a first-generation college student in your family?
I am.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
First generation American born, so a child of two immigrant parents from Mexico, but also first generation college educated at Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts.
Well, and part of why I raised that is I did go to Stanford, which if you know the geography of the Bay Area, Palo Alto and East Palo Alto are divided by a freeway, and historically have been utterly divided racially, economically, and part of what we are really glad to be talking about today in full spectrum thinking is a future that those divides will no longer exist. And so you are an incarnate version for me of the relationship building that in my years in college, I spent a lot of time in East Palo Alto actually, for a whole lot of really wonderful and creative reasons, mostly on the learning side for me. But I am grateful that we are in a world where conversations like this can happen. And may they be a foreshadowing of where we're headed. So
Gabe, say just a little bit about Eastside College Prep as well. That builds right on this.
Definitely. So Lisa, actually, two alums from Stanford University went over to East Palo Alto and realized that there was no formal school system in the small city of East Palo Alto, which has historically been, kind of Latino, African-American, Pacific Islander communities. The community actually forced its children to be bussed out to neighboring school systems. And I remember as a young child having the 6 a.m. had the bus to go out and be able to afford an education, get access to education. So from there, this kind of college prep school arose. Very, very small college prep school, kind of built off of personal donations and corporate sponsorships, where the focus is getting students of color who are the first in their families to go to college to attend. So far in their 25, 26-year history, 100% of the graduates from the school have been accepted to four-year colleges or universities.
Okay, so I'd like to jump in and share our basic model for how we do full spectrum thinking. And I'm hoping you're able to see that now. Can you confirm, please?
Yes, we see that, Bob.
Great, good sign. So this is Foresight Insight Action. It's part of the book. We're going to give you these slides, by the way, and we're going to give you the code if you want to buy the book or the trilogy. But the focus here is on mindset, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The other two books talk about literacies and skills, which we'll touch on, but this is all about mindset. And in particular, I'd like to link this to the traditions which you have in your faith. We call this prepare or hindsight in our models, but it's your pre-virus mindset and the stories you tell yourselves about the future. So here's where your three-legged stool fits. And here's where also the notion of discerning questions fits. But in a way, that also fits somewhere between foresight and insight. So mindset is where we all start. And the neuroscientists tell us that we all have what they call a personal neural story net. And some of us are more open, some of us are more closed. So, but all of us have stories, and our brains are wired for stories. And if they don't hear stories, they make them up. So we need to be great storytellers. And, you know, I learned this in divinity school. I went to the same divinity school that Martin Luther King went to, Crozier, in Chester, Pennsylvania. And I was there at the time Dr. King was killed. I never became ordained, but I retained this interest in spirituality and interest in religion while not being an advocate of any brand of religion. I remain a student, and I guess I would say I'm a kind of empathetic student. But I became a futurist. I went to Northwestern and did my PhD there, and I thought I was going to become a professor of sociology of religion. But something big happened. It was called the internet. It was actually called the ARPANET in those days. I was completely enthralled, as I still am, with the social and the organizational and even the spiritual impact of what we now call the internet. I'm focused 10 years ahead. We call this foresight, or a forecast is a specific subset. It's an external post-outbreak story. We're actually doing post-outbreak scenarios now, and we'll send links to you for those on our website at Institute for the Future. But we're always looking future back, not present forward. The present is too noisy. It's just too noisy to understand what's going on. But if you look long and work back, you can do what we call a forecast, plausible, internally consistent, and provocative, with signals to bring the forecast to life. And we use the William Gibson quote, "The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed." And tracking those signals is a lot of what we do. I just did a session for the neuroscientist David Rock on his weekly webinar. And the way David refers to it is, in this crisis mood, we hear quiet signals, but our brains are very noisy. So we got to listen for signals in a noisy brain. And particularly in a crisis, we have to be responsive to the crisis, but we have to somehow filter the noise to understand what's going on. And the way we do that is by looking long, by looking 10 years ahead, but not staying out there to work back. And that foresight is designed to provoke your insight. So an insight is an aha, a new story, a new clarity in your brain. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. You can't unsee the insight. So the goal of foresight is not to predict the future. Nobody can do that. The goal is to provoke insight by looking long and creating a new story. So discerning questions live right in this space. You can't answer them with yes or no. You have to engage in full spectrum thought. And full spectrum thinking is that ability to think across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptation of certainty. You want to come out of this with an action, an agile way forward, expressed with clarity, not with certainty, clarity, and ideally as a story. And the rule of thumb here is to be very clear where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. And the temptation of certainty is our brains want certainty. Our brains want the ability to categorize. But in a future world, the future will reward clarity, but punish certainty. Now, certainty gets get some engagement in the short run. And you see this with a lot of the populist movements around the world. And I'm not an expert in the present, and I don't talk about politics. I look 10 years ahead, but I have started and now continue to teach at the Army War College since 9/11. I've volunteered there, and I now teach the 3-star generals. They read this book their first week in Washington. And what I see in Washington as a futurist is a lot of certainty, but not much clarity. And what you need in a period of crisis like this is to seek out the voices of clarity and to resist the voices of certainty. And here, Gabe, I'd like you to jump in and just talk a bit about the importance of the true digital natives and the cross-reality natives now. So kind of think about that in a foresight, insight, action framework. Gabe?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. So there are countless examples that we've experienced of kind of external partners that have come to IFTF and gone through Foresight Insight Action. And one of them was the leadership of a global foundation, the MISC Foundation, who came to us. And, kind of their focus as a foundation is preparing young people for the world of tomorrow, for the jobs, the resources that they need to equip themselves to be ready for the world of tomorrow. And the foresight that we presented to them was this kind of emerging worlds, this ever emergent, more present world where workers are gig workers, where climate disruption is a very real thing, and it's going to become even more real and even more apparent and even more daunting. Kind of a term that Bob uses, the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The VUCA world gets more VUCA. And so we presented this forecast to them, and the MISC Foundation, they went through and they said, well, our insight is that, our programs aren't built to prepare our young people for this future world, for this world. And so the action plan that came out of this, they asked us to do a global research study for them, looking at lead learners from 6 different parts around the world. Lead learners, young people who in today's world are going out into the job market and saying, this isn't enough, and kind of creatively constructing their own tools, their own resources, their own skills, and said, when you look at those lead learners and you look at kind of the global landscape, what are going to be the archetype workers of the future? And so I was lucky enough to be a part of this global research project that went to 6 different parts of the world and really looked to understand what future skills are going to be needed by young people. And that's always been my area of focus, along with diasporas and kids and kind of their affinity towards everything digital. And what we realize is that the young kids, there are definitely regional differences across the globe. We went to places like Mexico, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, here in the US, even in China. And we realized that there were distinct regional differences, but across the globe, there was something consistent that was emerging. And that consistent thing that kept emerging was that these kids want a full spectrum approach to life. They want a full spectrum approach to education. They want a full spectrum approach to work. They want a full spectrum of approach to really every aspect of their life. And so that is something that has been fundamental and core to us understanding the worker of the future and what is the work and landscape for the next generation going to look like in the next 10 years.
So Lisa, I'm going to leave this graphic up for a little longer, but I wonder, do you have questions, or can you help us bridge now from our world 10 years out, looking back, to the world of the folks that are joining us here today?
Yeah, I would love to do that. And I want to actually encourage people who are watching. This is a lot of information coming at you really quickly. I'm going to just take 30 seconds and be quiet. Go ahead and put in the Q&A a question or an observation, like what's landed for you, because that will give me a clue about what would be most helpful as we discuss this further. Bob, one of the first question that showed up is, what does a full spectrum approach look like or mean?
Mm-hmm. Essentially, full spectrum thinking is this ability to seek clarity across gradients of possibility. while avoiding just putting new things into old categories, to seek clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptation of certainty. So the way our brains work, and I spent a lot of time with neuroscientists as we were writing this book, the way our brains work is they categorize, and they just love to categorize. And categories are fine if they're accurate and if they're fair, and if people are willing to accept how they're being categorized. Categorizing is not fine if it's thrown at someone like a net around a wild animal, the way that labels are often thrown. And I mean explicit labels like black or white or autistic. We categorize in ways that are often violent nowadays. Immigrant is another one. And yet we now have all these tools coming available for full spectrum thinking, tools like visualization, like gameful engagement, like neuroscience, like big data analytics. We don't have to categorize in these simple-minded ways anymore. We can think full spectrum, and full spectrum thinking isn't new. It isn't new. I mentioned when I went to divinity school at the seminary Dr. King went to. I was there when he was killed, and I was in a course with one of his former professors to recreate his intellectual influences. He was a full spectrum thinker. And later it was Jesse Jackson who used the term the Rainbow Coalition. And some of that is carried out into other social movements too. So full spectrum thinking isn't new. What's new is the need for it, the demand for it, the urgent concern about it, and the tools that make it so much easier to think full spectrum. There's no excuse to do this kind of simple-minded categorization anymore. So it's going to work in the short run because people are so confused, but 10 years from now, it's going to be embarrassing to be so simplistic.
That is really helpful. And I'm struck every time I read your work and think about this, that we've had some warm up for this language and this framing, because
We have.
the modernist, postmodernist debate, right?
Right.
The get out of the absolutes, the move towards the both ands.
Right.
And I am struck too, as I listen to you again today, that as church, particularly as Christian people who claim a belief in the resurrection, who claim that the horizon is actually this promise of eternal life, this promise for all people to be at one with God and one another, that we should be better at this than we often have been. We should be able to know where we're trying to go and be more gentle with the process and more imaginative about getting there.
Yes.
But so often the church institutionally, I think, becomes afraid, and we cling to those categories, those certainties, the bricks and mortar, the way we've always done it. And you're inviting us, I think, to look up, look out, look far, and realize that we actually have a theology that sustains this really well.
Yeah, you actually do. And we have a rule of thumb as futurists that almost nothing happens that's truly new. Almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So the question we always ask is not so much what's new, because if it's truly new, it's almost certainly not going to happen. We're asking what's ready to take off. And often what's ready to take off is kind of planted in the ground of long ago, yes, and ready to take off, ready to blossom. Your faith tradition, the Anglican faith tradition, wow, you could tell this story, this foresight, insight, action. You could tell it better than I can, completely within the Anglican tradition. It's just, from my experience as an outsider, you haven't always lived up to it, but you've got the story. You've got all the basics of the story. You can tell this, but you have to now tell it through the lens of the future and through the medium of digital amplification.
And that's this rich intersection. So we have the, yes, signals of our sacramental tradition, right? But
yeah.
Here we are in many parts of our church right now, experiencing a fast from Holy Communion or from Eucharist, right? So there's this sense of, so what becomes essential about our story? What, yep, does it mean to be these people of sacrament, these people, yep, of belonging to corporate rituals and practice and a sacramental, mysterious tradition? And what are we learning about ourselves and what is sustainable in this unusual and difficult time that we're living in? Yes. I'm interested, many of the stories, the questions that have come in are kind of focused in general on this piece about story how do we help people listen? I love the listening for signals and quietening the mind. How do we do that in the anxieties of the present? And even what a couple people are commenting on, even just beyond the 6 months. People, I'm certainly hearing this among church leaders. They're trying so hard to look out, but everyone in their congregation is so eager to get back in the building, or
Sure.
when will we be able to sing, or when can we have communion? So what can we say to people about how full spectrum thinking is inviting us to trust a future maybe greater than all we can imagine right now that's 6 months out?
Right, right. So I think the notion of future back is freeing, where present forward is constraining. So if there's a way to bring a future back perspective while honoring the urgency of the present, I'm not at all discounting that. It is, we have to respond to the urgency of the present. But if we get our language right about the future, if we get our clarity right about the future, it will draw us toward the future. If we get our language wrong, it'll fight the future and we'll get sucked back into the polarities of the present. But oftentimes the long view is where we have permission to find hope, where we have permission to find faith, you know, the roots of faith. And while I distinguish in the opening, I distinguish between clarity and certainty. In the last chapter of the book, which is all about new spectrums of meaning, I delicately move into the comparison between faith and belief, between faith and stories, and between belief and rules. And what I find is that faith gets embodied in stories, clarity gets embodied in stories. So the way to engage with the future during a crisis is to give people permission to think future back while honoring the urgency of the present. So you have to respond to the urgency of the present, but it can't be all that because it's just so noisy. It's just overwhelming. It's just so frighteningly noisy.
Lisa, if I could add to that as well.
Please do.
You know, the benefit that we see from doing long-term thinking, of doing futures thinking, of jumping out to the future and working backwards to the present is that ability to build resilience. And I can't think of a more fundamental kind of better reason for faith and religion and the church existing than to help build resiliency for the world that is to come. Right. And so what we do is we focus on urgent futures, and rather than, you know, kind of acting as a firefighter and putting out the next fire that comes about, which is very necessary. Right. We need people to focus on the present and do the work now. There is still that fundamental need to be able to look long and prepare more generally for what future disruptions hold. And that's really the key and the benefit. And if I could personally urge people in this community to focus on is not how do you respond to the immediate threat and the immediate questions of when can we get back, how do we do this, you know, how do we hold our services, how do we have these traditions and these rites, but rather how do we prepare for the next outbreak, how do we prepare for the next disruption, how do we prepare for the next iteration of chaos and uncertainty that is coming down the road, and is probably coming down the road a lot harder than what we're seeing today.
Right. So the key question is really, what's your clarity? And then what's your story to express that clarity in the face of the VUCA world, which Gabe is right. The VUCA world's going to get worse. So the expectation, it's not going to go back.
Can you repeat for people what the VUCA acronym stands for in case they haven't heard it before?
Sure. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's the opposite of your dog walking in the background.
That's right. You're lying sleepily on my couch.
So it's unstable. And this is a term coined at the Army War College. And there's a negative side of it that's absolutely true. In my teaching now, I've actually flipped it into a positive, and I think that's just as true. Volatility over the next decade in the future, volatility will yield to vision. So vision gets disproportionately rewarded in a VUCA world. Uncertainty yields to understanding. And this is a time for listening, not for shouting. complexity yields to clarity, and clarity is going to get rewarded in this future. It just may take a while. And finally, ambiguity yields to agility. You have to be extremely agile to thrive in this world. So there's both a negative and a positive VUCA. It's all described in the book. We can send you the breakdown of the acronyms too.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great. I was struck as you were talking that when we talk about the stories that we're living, so Jennifer Gamber, one of the participants, says it seems that the value of stories is an opportunity for faith communities.
Yes.
Are there archetypal stories that are durable and adaptable into the future that are the locus of meaning making?
Yeah, wow, nice question. One of the most intriguing storytelling projects that I've run into in the last few years was shortly after 9/11, the Army realized that in Afghanistan, the stories that Americans were bringing to Afghanistan were not working nearly as well as the Taliban stories. Mm-hmm. And they funded a project here in the US with neuroscientists and master storytellers. And they told people stories from master storytellers while they were in fMRIs with their brains being scanned. And that's where they proved that our brains are wired for stories. And if they don't hear stories, they make them up. Now, I learned that in divinity school. Everybody in this call realizes that's true. But now we have data. We have data. So there's no excuse not to get it anymore. It's all about storytelling. And here's the breakdown of the great stories that came out of that, the great stories that this project found in terms of what leads to behavior change. There has to be someone in the story that you can empathize with. Mm-hmm. Something bad has to happen to the person in that story. They tested something good and something bad. Something bad is much more powerful. Then there needs to be somebody, essentially, somebody to blame. And in the Taliban stories, it was always the Americans. Then there has to be some action that can be taken that pulls people out of it and allows them to express it. So many of you who studied Joseph Campbell, this is the essence of the hero myth.
Say we're talking hero myth. I was about to say that.
Yeah, this isn't new. This isn't new. You get it. It's the essence of it. But Aaron Sorkin, excuse me, the great playwright, what he says is every great story is the combination of intention and obstacle. Intention is clarity. Obstacle is always true. Intention and stories always have tension. Mm-hmm. So that's what you need. That's the story that we know the formula. We just need the new stories.
Yeah. I'm going to say one more thing, and then I think you may want to go on to a kind of second reflection of some more of your book. But Gabe, when you were talking, I was thinking, you were talking about using the example of a pandemic and the fact that being prepared for a future in which these things are more likely. One of the things that I thought about is, as people of faith, and particularly the Episcopal Church, where we hold our baptismal covenant very dearly, is what does human dignity look like in the future? Right? We've taken vows about honoring the dignity of all human beings at baptism, and yet we have underestimated what the work of that really would look like. And so to me, that's future back thinking, that I still want to be a person who lives by those vows in the future, but there's a lot of work to do to get me to the place where I am living that fully and wholly. And so in a sense, I often use the image of the guardrails are up. I know the limits of where I'm willing to wander, but I need to find new ways to get there.
Yeah.
And I was really struck that when you were talking about people needing to be ready for, if we're people of community and a sense of honoring our neighbor, then we really need to know what does it mean to recognize the dignity of all people who are currently excluded from many of the protections and privileges. So yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, definitely. And here it's delicate for me as an older white guy to reflect that I'm clearly a person of privilege. And I have to honor that conversation that's going on right now for restorative justice and for deep understanding of the injustice that's happened. When I was in divinity school and got to take these courses with the professors that taught Dr. King when he was in divinity school, I was intrigued, and I've still had this lasting impact about his clarity, which was all about social justice. And it wasn't just about civil rights. I had thought that that his clarity was more focused on civil rights. And indeed, this became very controversial at the end of his life. You see the biography that Tavis Smiley did at the end of about the end of his life. It was very controversial because he was at the first Earth Day,
Yes.
1968, a little earlier than that actually. And then he was in the Poverty March in Washington, all about the rich-poor gap, which we still have. It's getting worse.
And now is the Poor People's Campaign, and Bishop
now is the Poor
William
People's.
Barber, and tomorrow, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And he was also anti-Vietnam War. So you know, his people around him were saying, "You're getting too wide," and he's saying, "No. The clarity is social justice. The clarity is social justice." So that, I think, is the dignity of the human beings that we have to restore, but also we have to do it in a future context. And here I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and maybe in a startling way. As you think about humans 10 years from now, we're all going to be cyborgs. We're all going to be cyborgs because artificial intelligence, a term coined 67 years ago, 67 years. I mean, talk about that long to be an overnight success. It's going to get practical over the next decade. And you know, Tom Malone, the MIT professor, says this so eloquently. What he says is the big story about the next decade in artificial intelligence is not computers replacing humans. The big story is humans augmented by computers doing things that have never been done before. So he calls it superminds. And over the next 10 years, the superminds are going to happen. And it's up to us. What are those human dignity values that are going to be carried into the cyborg world? Are we going to yield that to the forces of evil? The forces of evil are all over this. You know, the criminals are better at this than we are right now. The military is better at this than the churches. So are we going to yield that, or are we going to embrace it? And I think TryTank, that's part of what you're exploring here, is how can you help create the superminds who will not only honor the dignity, Lisa, but explore the cyborg, you know, what's the cyborg equivalent to human dignity?
Right, and what are cyborg ethics, right?
Yeah, cyborg ethics. Yeah,
right.
So, you know, relook at Isaac Asimov, the rules for robots. They're finally getting practical now. And how does that play out? Are you in that game? Are you at that table? I don't see you there now. You're not at the table in Silicon Valley.
And one nuance that I want to add to this as well, just to throw in the conversation, is the next generation. We are seeing some incredible movement that is happening with activism and just general sense of mobility and gathering that the next generation has been able to utilize these digital tools. And there's a real sense of anger and frustration, and you know, it's no longer you're running against the clock. It's, you know, the clock is almost out on certain issues, and these kids realize that. And when you pin that with, you know, you pair that together with what Bob is talking about here, these new realities, these new abilities and affordances that, you know, kind of cyborgs, humans, and computers put together. I mean, it's a powder keg, really. If your organization, if your institution, if you as a leader are not prepared to have those conversations, I mean, you will quickly be passed over. You know, you will quickly be pushed to the side or be thrown into a seat where you know, you're seen as a bad person. You're seen as not being able to adequately address these concerns.
And just, Gabe, if I could build on that, and Lisa, I'm going to be a little wistful, I guess, is the moment, maybe a little critical. When I presented that forecast to you all, I presented it in St. Louis, and your presiding bishop was there, and I had 500 people in the room, and I presented the forecast, and I made the point Gabe was making. It's been clear that we now have the true digital natives. They're 24 or less. Now it's even more clear that 2020 is going to be another threshold year. It won't be just 2010. 2020 is the threshold year when you have technologies like the Oculus Quest And then you have the shelter in place and the homeschooling. Like I'm in our son's room right now. This is set up for homeschooling in Portland. And this is the reality. The kids 24 or less, and then the kids 14 or less, they're just going to be different than the rest of us. And they're going to be demanding. I mean, Greta Thunberg is the poster child for this, but there's many Greta Thunbergs all around the world, and they're becoming adults with great digital sophistication, and they're angry at us. They're angry at us for what we didn't do. In that room in St. Louis, I pointed directly to your presiding bishop, and I said, you got the chance. You got the chance to work with your kids and do reverse mentoring. In your parishes, you give the kids the power. They are gamefully engaged with this future. They are concerned about climate disruption and gun control and a bunch of other stuff, social justice. Let them take the lead on this. Work with the kids. Now, maybe that happened and I just didn't know about it, but I think this is the opportunity. And so let me not be critical about what you didn't do. Let me say it as this is your opportunity, the next decade, because now the young kids, and I mean the 14-year-olds, they're growing up activist, digitally savvy, and angry with good reason.
Amen. I want to put that in bold print somewhere. But an interesting complement to that is I have been conducting some listening sessions with a number of Episcopal congregations lately, and I have been deeply moved by older Episcopalians. I mean,
nice.
old, like retirement age older,
yeah.
whose lives are absolutely being transformed because of the pandemic,
wow.
because they are living in shelter in place experiences. They have pushed themselves to learn and acquire and engage
nice.
in ways using technology. But what's interesting is they're angry too. They're angry that the church let them down and put them in a category, your language, that said after a certain point in time, we don't learn things, or old people don't use technology, or they are, they're only interested in the conventions of the way we've always done things. I'm hearing this incredible urgency among older Episcopalians to contribute to a new future. So if we could somehow figure out, as you do at the Institute, a cross-generational way of having these conversations, I think both generations, all generations, are going to be able to help each other. And I think one of the most harmful categorizations we've had, certainly in North America, I don't want to overgeneralize, has been age-segmented identity structures.
No, I agree. I think
age is socially constructed, and I think we underestimate and we overestimate and we limit. And so I'm delighted that with your offering and opening to the youngest of young. And
so a simple suggestion is cross-generational mentoring, where you're learning from each other across generations. And I think for those of you who are leaders, I imagine most of you are, pair with a person that's much younger than you are or much older than you are, depending on where you are in the spectrum of age. But you're seeing Gabe and I side by side here. I don't know, Gabe, I almost don't do anything without you present anymore. Sometimes we're kidding when they ask for me, they get Gabe too. And when they ask for Gabe, they get me too. We're just, and I've been having these kind of partnerships for the last 15 years now. And rotating about once every 2 years. And it's, for me, it's been life-changing. And I learned so much from Gabe, and, it's kind of it's a reverse mentoring just as much as it's a mentoring. But each of you can do that. And if you're lucky to have kids that are 14 or less, I mean, that's a double count. You can be a better parent. Go there with them in the gaming world, learn about gaming, help them make smart and moral choices. But they're better at that world than we are, so learn from them. But Gabe, you want to chime in anything on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key here, Bob, is the reverse mentoring piece. I think a lot of people hear cross-generational mentoring and they think, okay, so I'm an older person. I'm going to get a much younger, kind of understudy and teach them everything I know. But really kind of what I've learned from working with Bob and supporting him on his work and book is that it really goes both ways. And Lisa, one of the things that, you know, I'm sure you will not come as a surprise to you is that Bob is really gracious about that, about being a lifelong learner. And saying, challenge me and push me, and where do you agree, where do you disagree, and what can you teach me today, and how can you force me to have conversations that I'm not comfortable having. One of the first tasks that I did, Bob, if you remember this, when I came to the Institute, is, you know, I went to Bob and we were talking about this idea of full spectrum thinking and everything falling on the spectrum. And I said, you know, Bob, there's something called the gender spectrum. And he says, well, I'm familiar with it, but I don't know the details. And I said, let me give you an example here. When you go on Facebook and you sign up for, you know, a new profile, back in 2018, when I first joined the Institute, there were 79 different gender options to choose from. 79. You know, most people thought maybe male, female, other, but there's this entire world of complexity and things. And so Bob really leaned in and said, you know, this may make me a little uncomfortable. I'm not sure. I don't know if I have the right way to talk about this. You know, help me have these conversations. Help me identify who the people I need to talk to and learn to about that. And I think that's key, and that's crucial to this point that Bob kind of presents here.
Absolutely. And one of the things I didn't say in the opening was many people have referred to Bob as the Episcopal Church's favorite futurist. And a part of that is the long work you've done with us. But part of it is that attitude that you're describing, Gabe, so beautifully, that sense of openness and deep listening and humility that comes, you know, you have this passion, you have this genius, but there's a sense of respect that we know that we do not know. And that the learning of what we do not know is what makes life exciting, right? That's why you're so vital, you know, at your age, and so able to continue to contribute. I mean, it's huge. And I think this might be where we take the pivot. And we talked before we opened the webinar a little about the language issue in framing. And one of the complex moments that we are in is this question about defunding the police. And how does full spectrum thinking inform a conversation and the actions that come in out of the important work that needs to be done in our local communities? And Bob, do you want to say a little about what you were saying about what you've come to understand about the tension there and the language?
Yeah. So let me first say that that this is an awkward topic for me. So I'll kind of struggle with my own ability to explain it. But I think if you go back to what I said earlier about if we get our language right about the future, it draws us toward us. And if you get it wrong, you fight the future. And then I'm also saying that in the current world, our politics is so polarized that it's like a no-win sort of spinning wheel in Washington of polarization that I'm trying to stay out of. I'm trying to look long and bring a future back perspective and avoid the polarization of the present. So I'm completely understanding and supportive of restorative justice principles. And I think people who have been exploited, been abused, and been unjustly treated, you know, they get to choose what that conversation is about, not me. So I'm definitely not going into that conversation. The conversation I am trying to introduce is if you can figure out a way to frame defund the police in a way that isn't just de something or defunding, but what are you replacing it with? So maybe it's reimagining. I do think demilitarizing the police is necessary, that it's just been too militarized. And there's obviously a lot more services that need to be done and that the police don't do well at all. And there's clearly racial injustice in the current police structure. So I think the challenge for us, I feel involved, but it's not just me. The challenge for Black Lives Matter, the challenge for social activists, the challenge for politicians, the challenge for companies, the challenge for communities is how do we create that clarity toward the future of a just future, not just a future that's not unjust. And how do we develop that clarity? And again, be very clear where we're going, very flexible about how we get there. I really like the fact that Black Lives Matter is so distributed. I think that's a power frame. And another forecast that I talk about in the book is anything that can be distributed will be distributed. And I think distributed authority computing is going to require that. So it's interesting in my teaching, I teach the new 3-star generals in Washington on their first week in Washington. And the last time I did it, I was following Madeleine Albright. And she was talking about, it was very humbling. That kept me humble. And the book she was talking about was her book called Fascism, A Warning. And I read the book with great interest. It's well worth reading. I have great respect for her, but I'm not nearly as pessimistic as her. And I think it's because I'm so much more digital than she is. I don't think fascism is scalable in the future digital world because anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So that is, I think, reassuring in a way, and it's one of the most hopeful elements of the new book. Now, let me put in a warning. In these shape-shifting organizations like Black Lives Matter or like a number of different groups, the power of them is that anything that can be distributed will be distributed. They grow from the edges, hierarchies come and go, they can't be controlled. But here's the scary thing. The criminals are better at this than we are. So terrorist groups are shape-shifting too. And they're really good at it. And they don't have the constraints that we have of rules or laws or ethics.
Or buildings.
Or buildings, yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah, just saying. So I think the challenge for those of us who want to create a better future is how do we organize for that? And, you know, when I was in divinity school, Saul Alinsky was the spokesperson for community organizing. We don't yet have the Saul Alinsky of cyberspace. And that's what we need, not necessarily a person, but the tool. Remember his Rules for Radicals, the book, the tools of social organizing. We don't yet have those for how to do community organizing in digital worlds. Now the kids are showing us how to do this. Remember how the Parkland kids, within a month after the Parkland shooting, the awful Parkland shooting, the kids had organized one of the largest marches in history. And these were drama students organizing in a living room and creating digital media in ways that were really, really impressive. So I'm really hopeful about the kids if they have hope,
I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking it would be good to kind of grab a couple more questions, if that's okay, from Q&A.
Oh yeah, I'm great. Yeah.
No, it's wonderful. So one person said, Bob Brown says, MLK, the I Have a Dream speech, is this an example of full spectrum thinking?
Yes, and it's also an example of clarity.
Yeah, good. I was thinking, because a couple other people were saying, can you clarify clarity?
Yeah, so clarity boils down to be very clear where you're going, very flexible how you get there. Dr. King was that incarnate. His writings are just eloquent in terms of full spectrum thinking and eloquent in terms of clarity. So yeah, it's
and rich in narrative story.
And rich in narrative. What a great storyteller!
I mean, so he just drew people in through his rhetoric. You know, that sense of
Exactly.
Let's see. Feel free to look at the questions, Gabe. If you see one you want to jump on, that would be great too. With all the noise, and I think you've spoken to this when you talked about the noise and the listening but it says, with all the noise and the partisanship, what kind of information can we feel clear about these days, much less certain? And I'm wondering if that's where you want to talk a little bit more about signals, perhaps?
Yeah,
that's
I will. And maybe, Gabe, you can chime in a little bit about how to find a signal. And we do teach this, so we can give you those resources. But let me just be specific here. But again, reminding you, I'm not an expert in the present, and I don't talk about politics. So those are the two caveats. But as you're listening to things, let's just take the novel coronavirus and the special case of COVID-19. As you listen to people who are talking about it, look for people who are clear and avoid people who are certain. So Bill Gates is clear. Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. This isn't Microsoft, although it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They've been doing pandemic forecasting for years now. They had this exactly right 5 years before the pandemic happened. It's just nobody listened to them. But by the way, we work with Microsoft. They did get it right. So they did listen to their founder, and they did build it into their planning. But most companies didn't do that, and certainly our government didn't. And here, not the current administration and not the previous one either. So we really have not been good at anticipating pandemics and even so much as understanding that pandemics are not a standalone phenomena. Pandemics are directly linked to global climate destabilization and global climate disruption. They're not two separate things. They're not two separate things. So look for the people with clarity. I would say Anthony Fauci has clarity when he talks about it. I would say Deborah Birx has clarity when she talks about it. Most politicians do not have clarity, but they do have certainty. But Gabe, maybe you can jump in and just pick up on the notion of signals.
Yeah, definitely. So signals comes from the very famous William Gibson quote, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And so signals are that unevenly distributed future. So we go to the world around us today and we say, what signals can we find? What kind of specific moments, and these can be products, these can be headlines, these can be stories, experiences that are happening in the world around us today that make us think, wow, this is actually counterintuitive to the way we've done things before. And if this thing were to scale long term, how would our worlds look differently? How would we react to a world where this small thing fully scales and that's the new normal? And that's really the practice that as futurists we have found extremely useful to help feed our forecasts and again get us to the point of building resiliency. And it must have been 5 years ago when the Institute for the Future worked with an insurance company. And in a workshop, they imagined, what does the world look like where in human interaction, where you can't shake hands? And someone 5 years ago probably thought, oh, what a playful, fun little thing to get to, but there were signals of that happening, that we could potentially get to that future. And if that future scaled, what would that mean? Fast forward 5 years later, we're in a global pandemic, and now we're having very real discussions about, will we ever get to a point where we shake a stranger's hand, where we hug people that we don't know too well, or we don't know who they've been in contact with. And that's really the point of the signal, is to help us prepare, to help us find and really question how we do things today and how things operate as normal, and what could we do to better prepare for potential disruption.
So another signal is if you, in conversation, if you run into a person who uses the word absolutely a lot, try to avoid that person. There's a temptation toward using the word absolute. There's very little use for the word absolutely during this kind of crisis or during the VUCA world in general. Just avoid that word. And if you find somebody who can't get it out of their lexicon, just don't deal with them.
I would just add to that, Lisa, anyone who says we've done it before, we can't do it.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, definitely. That's probably another one. We could excise a lot of this language. I'm looking at the time. We probably should wrap up, but I have one kind of provocative question I'd like to read from the Q&A, and then see what happens with it, and then maybe allow each of you just to say, what would you like to say to this particular audience that hasn't been said? Nice. These are church leaders who are willing to sign up in the middle of an afternoon or morning, depending on their time zone, or evening, to think differently about the future. And I commend them for doing that. So thank you all for being here. Too. But I'd love for each of you to have a chance, and let's do it in, let's have Bob go and let's leave with the younger voice. We'll have that be our sending voice. Nice. But the question here that I'd like to offer is from Dave Roderick. He says, in a full spectrum world, can following Christ, and I would put in there a particular religious conviction actually of any kind, can following Christ ever be anything more than just one possibility people juggle among all possibilities? Does anyone ever make an either or choice?
Yeah. So it's a profound question, and I don't know that I can do it justice. Let me just try. Um, First of all, I kind of checked out of God language at the end of seminary. So I just don't use it. So I'm not going to respond to the Christ part of it. But I do think that the word I would use is clarity. And clarity is very consistent with faith. And it does involve a leap of faith. And it does involve a very clear direction. And there are some things about which we can be certain, and you do have to draw a sharp line. I mean, you know, the 10 Commandments is probably a good start, but about stealing and killing and sexual harassment. I mean, there's some things obviously that are you can say sharply. But the point I'm making about full spectrum thinking is you want clarity and you don't want certainty. Beyond just the basics, and here I go back, Lisa, to what you were saying about human dignity. There are, I'm sure, some basics of human dignity that you know we would, I think, all agree on. So that's the only level I'd go to, and I do believe in the importance of clarity, but that clarity is expressed in a compelling story. Not in rigid rules and rigid rule sets. So that's my best guess at this.
Good. And I would say that clarity can lead to conviction,
Yeah,
which is different than certainty.
yeah, I think you're right. And
conviction can be that which I'm willing to lean into with my life. You know, that which I'm willing to sacrifice for.
Okay. Thank you for that. So yes, bring calling into the discussion. I really like the word calling.
I do too.
You know, so I think, and you know, I tell the story in the book about my chance to meet Peter Drucker in the last year of his life, and you know what he said was the first half of your life work on many different things and many different kinds of people because you don't know who you are. And the second half of your life only work with people you love to work with and only work on things you're passionate about. That's calling. You know, that's a kind of generic civil religion version of calling, I think. And the good news was he was 94 when he told me that. So the first half of your life is roughly 50. So,
I like that.
So yeah.
Okay. And I hear even that wonderful quote from Peter Drucker as wrapped in privilege, right?
It is wrapped in privilege.
Being able to choose who you are going to interact with at any point in your life. So we have work to do to free people up to have that opportunity.
Completely get it. Yes. Yeah. You know, but you know, he didn't exactly have a completely privileged background, but he grew up in Germany and he had 6 different careers before he was 60. I think he began as a journalist, but certainly he had privilege by the time I met him at Claremont.
And because he named it, it doesn't mean it's not true. It's a question of how do we bring the future to a place where it is.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, let's do these closing moments. And then I hope Lorenzo will jump in to say goodbye because this whole webinar was his idea. So he's been very in the background, but I want to say thank you, Lorenzo.
So the last thing I want to share is I've been doing this kind of, I got interested in being a futurist when I was the research assistant in divinity school for a conference on religion and the future. So I literally got to carry the bags for the world's leading futurists. And I said, that's what I want to do. So I actually did find my calling pretty early in my life, and was lucky enough to be in what came to be called Silicon Valley and joining Institute for the Future about 5 years after that. So I did find that quite early in my life. So I've been doing this a long time. I joined the Institute in 1973. So this is the forecast I've shared with you. This is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever done. So let me just settle that in. It is a frightening forecast. And it's the most hopeful forecast I've ever done. So it's like the stakes have gone up and some of the variables are the same. This idea of anything that can be distributed will be distributed, of global connectivity, that creates the fearsome future of global cyber terrorism. And it creates the hopeful future of being able to actually address global climate disruption and destabilization and making the climate better so we don't have to deal with these rolling pandemics. So I'm really optimistic about the future. I'm really optimistic about kids if we have hope. And you all are in the hope business. I mean, you're in the hope business. So I'm very respectful of what you're doing. I'm very appreciative of what you're doing. And I'm very thankful that you've let me talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And it is your hope that makes this so compelling, and we appreciate that. Gabe, take us out.
Oh goodness, Lisa, I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try very humbly. You know, Bob and I talk about, you know, our job is to provoke people that we come in contact with. We never tell people what to do, but Bob, with your permission, I'd like to tell people what to do here. It will explain itself. I'll unfold it. You know, this whole notion of clarity versus certainty, what we're telling people is steer away from certainty and go to clarity. Religion has historically, time and again, been a place where people go to look for certainty. You know, and increasingly in a chaotic, in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, there's going to be a much more desire by the general public, by the people, to look for that certainty. And what has been happening around the globe with these social justice movement, you know, kind of everything that's been happening, is really a call for accountability. And so we can't forget that as leaders, especially as religious leaders, as leaders who are kind of helping people guide them socially, but more importantly, spiritually, is that there is an accountability piece. And we have to understand that your role is helping people understand that even though they want certainty, they have to find clarity. And it's so easy to fall into the trap as a religious leader to say, yes, I've got the Bible, I've got the Word of God, I've got, you know, kind of this discipline, which is all based on certainty. And my urge, my inclination to the leaders on the webinar today would to be to steer away from that very easy conversation, that very easy trap, if you will. And I say this very respectfully, and lean towards clarity. Get people to steer away from certainty and lean into clarity.
Preach it. That was great. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you so much. Welcome back, Lorenzo.
Good. I've been here all along, like your guardian angels. So, and I have a feeling that there's going to be a whole bunch of sermons this Sunday about clarity versus. Everyone, before we send you off to say goodbye, if you could just take a second on your way out to answer the poll that's just arrived at your on your screen for the last few seconds. And then thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have this type of conversation. So thank you for joining us. You'll be getting an email in the next couple of hours, and that email includes all the resources that were mentioned here. Another link to the book where you can get the discount. You can get it also as a PDF. You can get it as an audiobook where Bob himself is narrating it for you. So it's pretty cool. So thank you all who have already voted. I certainly appreciate it. We certainly appreciate your work. So on behalf of all of us, I'm just going to wait till the 1 minute mark on the poll. So thank you all. Thanks for being with us. Thanks to Gabe and to Bob and to Lisa for a wonderful conversation.
And if I just could say, there are a lot of questions that we didn't specifically get to, but they reflect an interest that we have at VTS and with TryTank to continue this conversation with Bob and Gabe and the broader Episcopal Church. So you were heard, you were seen, and thank you for telling us there's some interest in this critical issue. So.
Excellent. So there we are. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate it. God bless you all. Be well, and we'll see you next time.